all-new global talk show, Newstellers. First of all, let's meet our panellists. Every week, we will gather around with international correspondents to talk about viral issues on social media. Our panelists will share their journalist perspectives on what's going on around the world. All right, welcome to the show. Now, if you have a look at this screen, have any of you seen this picture? This picture was posted on Twitter and Facebook recently.
That took place in Chile, I think.
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, there's a story of a 14-year-old Chilean girl who got this incurable disease, and she asked for the right to die. But in Chile, euthanasia is forbidden. So she posted a video begging, please, I want to die. And that moved a lot of people. And she didn't manage to change the law, but at least she got a visit from the president who came to visit her to a hospital room.
And actually, after Bachelet visited her, she changed her mind. And she
did?
Yeah, I saw it in the media that she changed her mind and she didn't want to die anymore. She wanted to try to give herself another chance, even if she had that kind of bad and terminal disease.
So I think that's the power of social networking services. How often do you guys personally use Facebook and Twitter to share your ideas and stories?
For me, Twitter really changed the way I worked. Now it became a professional tool I use every day. You can get news very fast. You can, in a couple of minutes, seconds, you can get opinion, facts. In Korea, I use a lot Kakao Talk, which is extremely useful to share jokes and silly ideas with friends.
Indeed. It's interesting how Kakao is so prevalent in the working industry in Korea as well.
I think Kakao Talk is a great tool for us. I know me and other journalists, we have group chats that we can share ideas on.
Right.
It's a great resource for, especially if you need to reach out to a large number of people very quickly.
Indeed.
To share contacts, to share information.
How about you, Stephen?
Well, I use all of the platforms that we've mentioned. I think as journalists, social media has really transformed what we do because it's become the fastest way of communicating any kind of information. It was once probably radio that might have been first, or television, but nowadays, before anything is filtered to a news organization in any way or edited in any way, a reporter on the spot can immediately upload a photo or some kind of breaking news and bring things to the audience in a much faster way than was ever before possible.
Okay.
Although sometimes too fast is not good.
That is a concern.
We'll get more into that later on. So I see you guys are making the best use of your social networking sites. And this is by no means exception to a lot of people out there. And this trend in SNS does represent how we set our topics for this show, Newstellers. So this is how we titled the first episode, SNS is all over the world. So what do you think makes SNS so appealing that people just keep scrolling down? Keep wanting to see more and more?
Well, I would like to talk about that example of he was calling the dancing man.
Okay.
He was a guy that he was kind of overweight. He was a London guy. And the thing is that some kids, they tried to make fun of him and they bullied him with a picture because he looked like funny dancing or something like that.
Right.
So the case went viral and a group of women, they decided to raise funds and to make a huge party in Los Angeles and invite that guy, and that guy was like the star of the party.
He was.
In that way, I think social networks can do a great job.
Well, I think of another case just last month in Delhi, the largest city in India. These 3 children that were abandoned by their father at a train station. And it's this very tear-jerking picture of them was uploaded on social media of these 3 kids huddled together looking very sad and forlorn. And someone posted this on social media saying, does anybody recognize these kids? Is there anybody who can help them? And so what ended up happening was the police came and found them and brought them to the police station. It turns out that they had been abandoned by their father and their mother didn't know of their whereabouts. So she was able to come down to the police station and pick them up. And what I think is most interesting about that is, as anyone who's been to India will tell you, there are children on the street everywhere. People presumably just going about their daily lives walk past children who are by themselves in the street and don't react in any particular way. So I think that's a case that really shows us the power of social media to achieve positive things.
That's amazing.
Sure thing. Well, you know, I'm thinking back at the end of last year, this is related to a news event, you had the hostage situation in Sydney, Australia.
Yeah.
During that time, many Muslims felt very unsafe, that they were worried about a negative backlash. There was a social media Twitter trend that popped up that time where an Australian man said, hey, I will ride with you. That, you know, don't worry if you feel unsafe, like I'll accompany you on public transport, I'll walk with you wherever you need to if you feel unsafe. And that it went viral, and it was a positive backlash to a very negative situation.
Any others? Any other examples?
Yeah, there is this story I really like. It's a story of two Korean sisters from Busan. They were adopted, one in France, one in the US, and they didn't even know they existed.
Oh yeah, I heard about this.
Yeah, and one learned about the existence of the other thanks to YouTube. She saw a picture of this girl on YouTube. She, oh, she really looks like me. So she Googled information about her. They met through Facebook, and then they wanted to meet, but they didn't have the money. So to finance their trip, they made a campaign on a crowdfunding campaign. So they made a documentary about their encounter, about how they finally met after 25 years. And I think it's a good example of how SNS can shrink our globe to
I think that story all gave us a little glow inside. On the other side, though, SNS is becoming a bigger and bigger part of our lives, and it is causing some negative effects as well. The former Manchester United manager Sir Alex Ferguson once warned people that Twitter is a waste of time. There are a million things you can do with your life other than that. Go to a library and read a book. But have you guys ever been in any kind of trouble or come across any negative sides to using SNS?
I've not encountered any negative experiences myself, but if you follow social media, there's no lack of examples of unfortunate things that have happened where SNS has played a role.
Indeed.
I came across another recent case of a young woman in Alabama in the US who was shot to death not long ago after she was participating in a fight that I guess her and some other young people had planned on Facebook. They had been arguing on Facebook and they had planned to meet up. And while this was going on, while they had met up in this public place, other young men with guns showed up and they fired indiscriminately into this fight as it was happening, and she was hit and she lost her life.
Oh gosh, that's terrible.
I mean, we can't say that such things certainly wouldn't take place if it weren't for social media, but in that case, you could point to social media as providing a kind of forum for what led to a very negative outcome.
And there is as well the negative aspect on a much more personal level. There is this example I find really interesting in France. There is this very famous French journalist, Guy. He was an avid Twitter user. He spent his time tweeting, and he became totally obsessed, totally addicted to Twitter. All his obsession was writing a next tweet and get as many followers as possible. And he lost so much sense with reality that he fell into great depression. And he ended up writing a book about how Twitter can be dangerous on a much personal level.
But I think what we need to keep in mind is we are ultimately at the control of how we use these. So the example you just gave, Fred, I think maybe that journalist might have had issues that existed before Twitter, and Twitter just allowed them to come out.
So that relates to an example I came across recently about an issue that has always existed, bullying, but it's taken it onto the cyber forum. I don't know if you guys have ever watched celebrity mean tweets on Jimmy Kimmel.
I saw Barack Obama do that just a couple weeks ago.
So basically celebrities go on air and they read mean tweets about them, tweets that just people in the public have posted, and you know the public doesn't hold back. But this advertisement took young people, students, who had received mean tweets, real tweets from the people around them. And just some of them were just heartbreaking. I mean, one in particular stood out. It just, no one likes you, go kill yourself. Something like that. And it really hit hard.
I think every school these days, they should do some education about how to use the social networks, about how not to hurt others with the social networks, and how to be responsible yourself for not getting addicted to social networks.
Because it's still a relatively new phenomenon, social media. I mean, the last 5-10 years. So I think the medium and long-term effects are just starting to come through now. All right, so I'm sure there are certain parts of social media then that appeal to more traditional media, such as TV news and newspapers. And actual news consumption has been reportedly moving from online portals to mobile SNS now. You can see clearly that the use of the computer is decreasing and more people are looking for their news on their mobile, with a 35% increase in the past 2 years. What do you guys think about that? Would you agree?
I see it in my daily life every day. It used to be that if you rode the subway in the morning, everybody would be reading a newspaper. But now if you get on the subway in any major city during the morning rush, everybody is looking down and glued to their phone.
They are.
And it's obvious what the advantages of consuming news in that way is. You don't have to pay for a subscription to a newspaper. You don't have to get your hands all black with ink. The mobile platform allows you to browse content from a very wide range of media outlets. It allows you to get things that are more current news that's come up. So it's obvious the appeals of consuming news in that way and why these numbers are moving in the way that the data shows.
You know, new media companies that mainly depend on social media views, such as BuzzFeed and Huffington Post. What do you think is so special about these sites?
There are some sites that that use that catchy things. You know, when we go on Facebook, we have to rule out like 95% of the things that we see, and we only click in a couple of them, right? On those stories that they look like more catchy, or they give you like some kind of a feeling that you want to know a little bit more. So I think those kind of media, they take advantage of that.
Yeah.
I mean, so many times I've looked at an article that says, "You won't believe the incredible things this guy says," and then I read it, and it's really not that incredible at all.
I think it will not, I mean, readers will get very annoyed. I don't think this clickbait tendency will last for long. Because what matters ultimately is the content. And if a website is successful or not is if you provide good content.
What do you think is the actual biggest difference, though, between social media and traditional media?
Well, with social media, I mean, it levels the playing field. It lets anyone who is at a news event or wants to just propagate their opinion to weigh in, which is really good. I mean, it broadens the discussion. But traditional media, there's a structure, there's a hierarchy. It is a reporter whose work has been vetted by an editor, and perhaps even more up the food chain, where there's that kind of observance doesn't happen with social media. So you have to be careful what you read on social media. It might not be as accurate as the person who posts it says it is.
Yeah, my idea is that social media and traditional media, they complement themselves. I mean, for example, in 2012, when Whitney Houston died, it was on Twitter 55 minutes before that it was on the first newspaper.
Oh, really?
I think it's, the social media, they fulfill that role of giving us some breaking news. Then the traditional media, they just give us information.
Right. But then the other side of that coin is that there can be a lot of false stories on the internet as well. So let's have a look at a couple of examples then. Last year, the Sewol-ho Ferry disaster, the biggest disaster in Korea for a long time. So countless false stories spread all over social media after that event. And one of them was about a fake request for help, saying there were still survivors on board, which turned out to be incorrect. And that must have been heartbreaking for the families to hear those rumors.
In that case, I think one of the problems was the media pick it up. A lot of media talk about this call. They should not. It would not have become so big if media check before broadcasting this kind of story.
So they need to verify news as well.
Media made a big mistake at the time.
But there's a big risk there, because I feel like in a big breaking emotive news story like the Sewol, editors are desperate for something that can get ahead, to have some kind of scoop. So if somebody on social media is claiming something that could be really big, I think editors are really reluctant to sometimes use the amount of caution that might be desirable in that case, because what happens if this ends up actually being verifiable and we miss out on it and all these other media outlets do have it?
That's what makes the difference between a blogger and a journalist. I mean, as a journalist, you have to respect some rules.
I agree. I'm just saying that I think where the instinct to sometimes jump on these things comes from that sort of fear of being left behind. And as journalists using social media nowadays, we need to be extra careful to sometimes fight that inclination to jump on things without going through the proper professional process of verifying them.
Yeah, of course, but in the case of Sewol, it was for the authorities who gave the wrong numbers. So I think, of course, you have to check, but how can you check if the official authorities say the wrong number?
I mean, I reported right away. In the first hour of it, they were reporting that everyone survived, and I mean that was a report that I sent out, and then
I mean.
Wow.
But there wasn't an SNS problem at all. There was authority.
That was,
But the
the
SNS
government
amplified that wrong information. That's
All
the problem. But
Let's move on. In 2012, a post on Weibo, the Chinese version of Twitter, sparked rumors that the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un was killed, and this was also later found to be untrue.
I think it just make it faster and easier for lazy journalists who don't want to fact check their stories to publish things. In France, we had a lot of newspapers who pick up like terrible, very bad stories from the internet about North Korea without checking anything and making article about it.
And remember, this is Weibo, so this took place in China, where there is no freedom of the press. So I mean, I think in countries and societies where there are limitations on freedom of expression, I think they're more prone to rumors because there's no trust in society. No one knows what the truth is. So perhaps it's more likely that these type of rumors get spread so easily.
Very good point.
It's also that, I mean, when it comes to North Korea, I think people are a little bit too liable to believe these crazy and lurid stories. But we also need to keep in mind that the reason for that is because it's really difficult to verify anything that happens in North Korea. It's not like anyone can just call up the North Korean government and say, there's a rumor that Kim Jong was assassinated. You know, can you confirm or deny that? That type of conventional journalism is impossible.
Yeah, but you have rumors, for example, the rumor saying that, everybody in North Korea has to have the same haircut as Kim Jong-un. That was ridiculous. And that's very easy to check. It's you don't need, you just need to make a couple of phone calls.
it's very easy to check, but it's easier to spread out because, you know, everybody clicks on Facebook, clicks on Twitter, and nobody just checks that information.
This is the problem with North Korea, reporting on North Korea, is that there is this baseline understanding that anything could happen. You could have, uncles fed the dogs. You could, whatever happens is possible because people assume, North Korea is this crazy dictatorship. So sounds real.
Yeah, but the problem is a lot of media don't even bother checking. They think, it's North Korea. We cannot check, so we won't do it. And this haircut story was in a lot of French media.
That's crazy. I think that last World Cup was something that there was some kind of news about. They say that the North Korean regime said to their people that they won the World Cup. So it was kind of a funny story, but everybody took it for real, and they spread it out, and it was like so ridiculous, right? And
well, fortunately, North Korea has its own Twitter feed and social media presence now too, so we can.
And lastly, during Hurricane Sandy in 2012, a man falsely posted on Twitter that an energy company was going to be shutting off all the power in New York City.
It's of course tragic that in a very vulnerable situation like that, someone would spread misinformation, but we also have to ask ourselves, I mean, how do these cases end up being taken seriously? I mean, like, why is there nobody saying, well, who is this guy and how does he know this and why should we treat this information as being credible in any way?
And in contrast to North Korea, that would have been much more easily verifiable.
Exactly, yes.
But I'm wondering if, non-journalists, just members of the public, just took these little snippets of information and just spread it.
I think in a situation like Hurricane Sandy, where there was a lot of panic going on, like my family is in New York and New Jersey, so I mean we were at the epicenter of Hurricane Sandy. So I think people were we were being told by the meteorologists leading up to that it's going to be the worst storm of the century. So people were panicking anyhow. So it gave space to people with malicious intent, like this man who said the power company was turning off the electricity. It gave them space to be taken more seriously, unfortunately.
Right. So again, just highlighting the need for verification, for checking all those facts by reputable news sources. All right, so continuing on with that theme then, everybody with Twitter or a social networking site can be a reporter in some sense. So do you guys think, as journalists yourselves, it's getting harder to define that role of journalist?
I don't think so.
You don't think so?
I don't
Okay,
think so
why is
at all.
that?
Because I think everybody can say like, oh yeah, I saw that happened in my neighborhood, and it could be an interesting story. But nobody who wants the information is going to be satisfied with that if he wants to know more about it.
It's such small snippets,
So yeah,
isn't it?
it's just a hint.
Not a full story.
It's just a hint. It's just a source. So I think social media gives you the source, then the traditional media gives you the information.
But you really need context. You need context in a story, and that can only come out through traditional media. It takes time, it takes reporting, it takes an editor, it takes seeing the bigger picture to get the full story. Sure, people on the scene using Twitter or Facebook, it's very useful, especially in a breaking news story. But if you really want to understand, the background, I think traditional media still, whether that be a newspaper or the evening news or what have you, it's still probably the best source.
I think a better term might actually be professional media.
Okay.
Because I think the distinction is when something comes from a reputable news organization, these are people who are trained and professional in this area, and they're earning their living by discovering and vetting and reporting information in a way that someone who's just using their own blog or just using Twitter is not doing. So I think that's really the distinction that we need to emphasize here.
And something that I like as well is the interaction with readers. This is new, and this is very, I really enjoy this. When you write articles, you got tons of comments, sometimes good, sometimes bad. They give you new perspective, ideas, opinion, and that can be useful. But at the end of the day, when you have to write your article, when you have to gather your news, when you have to make your article interesting, you're alone. That no reader is going to write your article for you.
I'm sure the responses have changed over the past few years as well. I mean, I'd like to hear your thoughts on how we can get readers involved in producing news as an alternative reporter without the adverse side effects that we've talked about.
I think at this stage in the media's evolution, it's more important to have readers trained in a way that they can assess information in the kind of critical way that we've been discussing here today, that we have to do as journalists, and perhaps focus on that instead of jumping ahead to having readers be producers of news also.
I think you need professional journalists. So I mean, it's readers produce content. There is blog. There is a lot of good things that are already there. But I don't think we should particularly try to ask readers to produce more than what's already naturally happening.
Okay.
In my case, I think it's especially interesting about the specialized readers that they can produce some content. Like, for example, if you're a doctor, you're not a journalist, but you can do in your blog some things that can be useful for people. But it's not journalism. It's just a blog. It's just a specialized information about something, and that's great. I think that's something that complements information and complements journalism.
Yeah, it might be great to have a doctor write a blog about things, but we don't know his interests. We don't know what his background is. But yeah, I mean, sure, it's interesting, to get professionals that are in the field giving out their opinions, but you have to take it as an opinion.
Yeah, of course.
So it's time to wrap up the show now. We'd like to close with your final headlines, a single sentence summary, if you will, of your thoughts and ideas on today's talk. Fred?
I'm not sure if that's very clickbait, but my final headline would be what really matters is the content and not the medium.
Okay.
Okay, I would say social networks and alcohol, make a responsible use of them.
Okay.
I've never
Totally
written
agree with you.
clickbait, but I'm going to do it now. Social media, the incredible, amazing aspects that you won't believe.
I'll let you get away with it once.
Well, that's a tough act to follow, but I would say social media, the avalanche of information that's sometimes difficult to hide from.
Very concise and insightful. Thank you so much, panelists, for joining us. And join us next week for a whole new global talk show, Newstellers. We will be open for any opinions or requests on our official website as well as our Facebook page.
Aquí a mi espalda, en el Centro de Arte Sejong, en pleno centro de Séoul.
Ne semble pas s'inquiéter outre mesure pour le moment.
When the news came out, there was a woman standing behind me.
Leaders from over 50 nations will discuss how to protect the actors.